If you work in German manufacturing, your job security runs through a five-stage pattern. Germany is at stage 4, and the clock started in 2011. Germany didn't make one mistake. Germany stepped into a five-stage pattern that kills industrial economies. And the paradox is simple. The country that built Europe's industrial backbone is now discovering how fast a backbone can snap. Here's the promise. 5 stages, one blueprint, and where Germany sits inside it right now. Because this isn't about vibes. It's about inputs, costs, supply chains, and the things you can't rebuild on a 4-year election cycle. Here's the part nobody explains to you. Industry is not a single factory. It's an ecosystem. And ecosystems don't come back just because you decide you miss them. When an economy is industrial, it can do 3 things at once: make complicated stuff, export it, and train the next generation inside the machine that produces it. When an economy deindustrializes, those 3 things detach. Production leaves first. Then the training pipeline dries out. Then the export strength turns into import dependency. That's the loop we're tracking. And once the loop reaches the late stages, reversing it becomes brutally expensive. Now, the 5 stages. Stage 1 is always the same. Cheap energy shows up from somewhere else, and the country starts acting like it's permanent. The energy doesn't have to be Russian. It can be Middle Eastern oil, North Sea gas, colonial coal, or American shale. But the psychological effect is identical. Cheap inputs feel like a national talent. Germany's stage 1 had a specific shape. In 2021, Russia accounted for about 52% of Germany's gas imports. And Nord Stream mattered because it was more than a pipe. It was a cost advantage that felt engineered. A Brookings analysis described Nord Stream as supplying 2/3 of Germany's total imports in 2021. That's not a minor supplier. That's the main artery. Now add the second part of Germany's stage 1 story. The decision to shut down nuclear, locking the system deeper into gas. Germany's last 3 nuclear plants were shut down on April 15, 2023. Isar 2, Emsland, Neckarwestheim 2. People argue about that decision like it's ideology. But inside this pattern, it plays a simpler role. It narrows your escape routes. And this is where the story flips. Because stage 1 feels like maturity, but it's actually exposure. Now look, one border to the west. France ran the opposite playbook. After the oil shock, France accelerated nuclear build-out as an energy-independent strategy. The Mesmer Plan is the name most people attach to that decision. You don't have to worship nuclear to understand the contrast. France paid upfront to reduce dependency. Germany optimized for cheap imported fuel and flexibility. Stage 2 is cost advantage collapse. The cheap input gets cut off, repriced, sanctioned, or weaponized. In Germany's case, the shift is visible in a single line from the regulator. Gas imports from Russia dropped from 52% in 2021 to 22% in 2022, and deliveries through Nord Stream 1 fell to 0 by early September 2022. That's stage 2 in one image. The input that made your prices competitive becomes a liability. Here's what matters to you. Industry doesn't care about speeches. Industry cares about unit costs. If your electricity is consistently more expensive than your competitors, you lose over time, not because you're lazy, because the math closes your margins. And this is the detail that should worry you. The US has structurally cheaper energy, not because Americans are smarter, because the resource base and pricing structure are different. The U.S. Energy Information Administration's 2024 table puts average industrial retail electricity price around $8.13 per kilowatt hour. That's the floor many global manufacturers benchmark against. In Europe, industrial power prices vary widely, but Germany's problem is not a single spike. It's persistent cost pressure layered with policy complexity and grid fees. Reuters described Germany's electricity prices as among the highest globally, citing an average around 38 euro cents per kilowatt hour in the first quarter of 2025. That's not a rounding error. Now, be careful. Industrial customers often pay different rates than households. There are exemptions, contracts, and subsidies, but the direction is what matters. Germany's energy-intensive sector started asking a very simple question. Why produce here when the same factory can run cheaper somewhere else? That question is stage 3, the hollowing out. And this is the move everyone misses. Stage 3 doesn't look like collapse at first. It looks like strategy. Companies keep the headquarters, they keep the branding, they keep the language, but they move production. And more importantly, they move the next investment cycle. In the chemical industry, you can see it in BASF's own words. In February 2023, BASF announced closures of major assets at Ludwigshafen, explicitly citing high production costs. And in parallel, BASF's growth bet tilts toward Asia. Their investor materials describe the Zhanjiang Verbund project in China as a major strategic investment. That's stage 3 in practice. Retrenchment at home, expansion where costs and demand look better. In autos, the signals are different but familiar. Volkswagen has openly floated measures that used to be unthinkable in Germany's post-war model. In 2024, Reuters reported VW considering factory closures in Germany for the first time. That's not because Germans forgot how to make cars, it's because the cost stack shifted, and Chinese EVs don't care about your heritage. And it's not just one company. A Reuters survey in 2024 said more German industrial firms were reducing investment in core processes due to high energy costs, and that competitiveness was at risk for many. Politicians call this adjustment. They call it transition. They call it temporary pain. But in the 5-stage pattern, we know what it is. It's stage 3, the industrial body keeping its face while the muscle relocates. Now we reach the hinge point, stage 4. Dependency lock-in. Stage 4 is not some factories left. Stage 4 is when the ecosystem itself breaks. It's when you lose the invisible infrastructure. Specialist suppliers, tool and die shops, maintenance crews, local chemical feedstock loops, apprenticeship ladders. And once those scatter, you can't just reshore. Because reshoring isn't a speech. It's a synchronized rebuild across thousands of firms. This is why stage 4 is the dangerous stage, because it still looks salvageable on paper, but the real system has already moved. Germany's stage 4 tell is not a headline about decline. It's policy trying to simulate the lost advantage. A country doesn't subsidize industrial electricity at scale because everything is fine. It does it because the market signal is screaming. Germany's coalition agreed a power price package in late 2023 aimed at relieving energy-intensive industries. And Reuters reported in late 2025 that power price support for industry was set to be introduced in January. That's not moral judgment, that's classification. Stage 4 economies stop competing on raw advantage. They start compensating for missing advantage with fiscal patches. And here's the quiet trap. Subsidies can slow the bleeding, but they don't automatically recreate supply chains. When stage 4 sets in, the dependency migrates. You become dependent on external energy, external components, and external capacity. Now, people will argue. They'll say Germany is too big, too advanced, too engineered to deindustrialize. That argument misunderstands the pattern. The UK was too experienced to deindustrialize too. The Rust Belt was too productive to hollow out too. Stage 4 doesn't care about pride. It cares about repetition and replacement. If a lost supplier is replaced by an external supplier long enough, the external supplier becomes the new system. And COVID gave the world a preview of what dependency looks like. Not in theory, in shortages, in delays, in we can't get the part. Ukraine added the energy dimension. Suddenly, secure input turned into strategic risk. This is why Germany is at stage 4, because the country is now trying to buy time while the industrial organism rewires itself around dependency. Now we need to talk about stage 5, permanent deindustrialization. Stage 5 is what happens when the rebuild window closes. Not because it's impossible in physics, because it becomes politically and financially unrealistic. Stage 5 looks like a nice country. Cafes, tourism, finance, consulting, culture. But under the surface, it's an economy that can't produce enough tradable goods to anchor its living standard. So it leans harder on services and asset prices. Here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. If your industrial base shrinks, your bargaining power shrinks too. Because the world doesn't just trade values, it trades output, it trades leverage. This is why Britain is such a clean proof point. Deindustrialization didn't happen in a single crash. It happened as a sequence. And Germany's speed claim matters here. Britain's shift stretched across decades. Germany's compression comes from how fast energy shocks, global competition, and supply chain fragility stack today. Now, pause. Because this is where people try to escape the pattern with one sentence. They say, Germany will green energy its way out. That's the escape fantasy. And it has a kernel of truth. Renewables can lower marginal power costs. Electrification can reduce fossil dependence. Grid upgrades can smooth volatility. But here's the mechanism problem. Even if the future is clean electricity, you still have to survive the transition without losing the ecosystem. Because factories don't wait politely for your grid to catch up. They move when the cost stack makes them uncompetitive. And if they move long enough, stage 4 hardens. Suppliers reroute, workers retrain, local knowledge leaks away. So, green your way out is not a single decision. It's a race between infrastructure build-out and industrial erosion. Now watch the neighbor, France. France is not perfect. France has its own issues: maintenance cycles, politics, demand stagnation. But in 2024 and 2025, the French grid story has been blunt. France has been exporting a lot of electricity, and their grid operator has described supply outpacing demand. In 2024, France recorded the highest net export balance in its history, around 89 terawatt-hours, according to RTE's electricity review. That's a neighbor sitting on abundant electrons, which means the energy war inside Europe isn't just fossil versus green. It's also exporter versus importer. And this is where the pattern becomes uncomfortable. Because if France can run a more stable electricity position, it becomes an industrial magnet. Not by propaganda, by price signals. Now bring it back to stage 4. Dependency lock-in is the stage where the country realizes it can't simply decide to produce key inputs domestically again. Not fast, not cheaply, not at scale. The supply chain is not a shopping list. It's a living network. When enough nodes go dark, you don't get the network back by turning on one light. You need the whole web. This is why stage 4 tends to drift into stage 5. Not because people stop caring, because rebuild costs explode while political patience collapses. And you can literally see the state stepping in. Germany's grid fees are set to drop sharply in 2026 due to billions in subsidy support, according to Reuters. Again, an IV drip. So what does this mean for you? Not as a German policymaker, as a normal person living inside the machine. If an industrial base shrinks, the first effect isn't collapse. The first effect is quiet stagnation. Wages become harder to grow. Because high productivity tradable sectors are the engines that pull living standards upward, tax pressure increases. Because the state still has the same obligations, pensions, healthcare, infrastructure, but a thinner base of high-value output to fund them, and the country becomes more sensitive to external shocks. Because it relies more on imports for critical goods and more on global prices for energy and components. That's why your rent and groceries feel heavier over time. Not because one villain is stealing your money, because the structure that used to generate surplus is fading. Now zoom out. Because the ending is where this becomes a series. Germany is not the only country running some version of this pattern. Germany is just the clearest because the industrial base was so central to Europe's identity. The question isn't, will Europe have industry? The question is, where will it concentrate? And here's the part we'll come back to in future episodes. Europe may be splitting into two categories: countries that can produce abundant, stable electricity, and countries that have to buy it at the margin. In that world, industrial location isn't just about labor skills, it's about energy geometry. And energy geometry becomes political geometry. Germany's bet was not irrational. It was optimized for a world that no longer exists. Cheap imported gas, stable geopolitics, predictable globalization. Now, Germany is trying to rebuild inside a world where those assumptions broke. And stage 4 is the point where trying becomes a race against irreversible dispersion. So here's the closing image. A country can still look wealthy while it loses industrial sovereignty. It can still have engineers while it imports the parts. It can still have brands while the production happens elsewhere. And it can still say, we will reindustrialize, while paying to keep the last ecosystem alive. The five-stage pattern doesn't end with a crash, it ends with a new normal. And the final question is the one that decides the next decade of Europe. If Germany is already in stage 4, which countries are quietly in stage 3 right now, calling it transition? And which ones are positioning themselves to profit from the drift?